We are moving to chapter 4 today, and I'm going to read just verse number 1 this morning. What quarrels and what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? We are entering what seems to be a new section, but it is not one wholly disconnected from the previous section. James does at times seem to jump at random from one topic to another without any real discernible connection between them, though he uses verbal connections a lot. But there is, I think, some flow or connection between chapter 3 and chapter 4. In chapter 3, he begins by telling us to watch our tongues. He stresses the fact that untamed tongues are incredibly destructive and divisive, and they can become the tools of the devil. He then moves to wisdom, which in the tradition which he's writing is often connected with what we say or don't say. He talks about wisdom that comes from above, that brings peace, and the wisdom which is earthly, or in fact demonic, which brings disorder. And then he moves to chapter 3, and he begins, or 4, and he begins chapter 4 with a question, which he often does when he's introducing a new topic. As a matter of fact, he had done this in just recently in chapter 3, verse 13, when he begins talking about wisdom by asking, who is wise and understanding among you? And now his question is, what causes quarrels and fightings among you? Now, the you here, remember that this letter is from Bishop James, Bishop of Jerusalem, and it is addressed to churches, to believers. And in this question he asks here in verse 1, I think I hear a lot of frustration and even righteous anger from James as he writes. I doubt that he's addressing hypotheticals from where would come fightings and quarrels if they were among you. There's no sense of that. There are fightings and quarrels that he's addressing here, and he's asking where they come from. In this question about the origin of quarrels, I think I hear another question that's being raised given the flow of what has been said so far. So James would say, given the fact that wisdom from above brings peace and that you are God's people, I'm not writing to the world, I'm writing to God's people who should be asking for and receiving this wisdom from above that brings peace. Why are you still fighting and quarreling? Why isn't there a difference between you, who should have this wisdom from above, and the world, which has earthly wisdom, which leads to disorder and chaos? James is not happy with the church here. The conflict between heaven and hell that he has hinted at in chapter 3, both in talking about the tongue and in talking about wisdom, this conflict is now in chapter 4 front and center, and we see it as a full-fledged war. And we are very much a part of it. It is very interesting. I find it interesting that he's just talked about peace and the wisdom, that the peace that comes from godly wisdom, and then he immediately puts us into a conflict, a war. The purpose of course, these wars, a good war, right, that we are in, would be the end of peace. And it is important to remember that we are indeed at war. He will make this clear in chapter 4. You're at war. You either pick being on God's side or the devil's. You're either friends of God or a friend of the world. And God and the devil are at war. When we are baptized, we are initiated into the ranks of an army, God's army. We're taking a stand. We take up his banner and a vow to fight the world, the flesh, and the devil. I've been going through the baptismal service again recently, and it's very clear that in the baptism, it is the clarity of the fact that the person being baptized is told, you are taking a side. You're on God's side, and you are to fight as his soldier. But it must be the world, the flesh, and the devil that we fight, and not each other. It is a very hard thing to do, to be at war with evil and be at peace with our brother. That's a hard thing to do. In part because there is inevitably some evil in our brother. He is not wholly sanctified and pure, and I am not wholly yet sanctified yet and pure. And so it is hard to be at war with evil and peace with our brother. But it is vitally important that we work towards this. One of the devil's most effective tactics in the war is to get us to turn the points of our swords away from him and towards each other, while we still claim in the process to be fighting the devil. We lend our tongues to his service in our abrasiveness towards one another, in our gossip about each other, in our bitter jealousies and selfish ambitions. We subtly jostle one another for position or engage in outright wars with one another. And James says this must not be so. The quarrels and fighting, the words he uses here in verse 1, can mean physical conflict, just like our talking about battles and fights can as well. And in some cases, we will see, he may actually mean physical conflict. But they also are very often used for verbal altercations. And given the fact that James has just spent a lot of time talking about the destructive power of the tongue, I think we're right to hear much of that in this passage. So James is saying, church, you should not be using your tongue to destroy one another, to fight one another. Now, I feel like I have to do this. I'm saying this because I'm talking about it because this is where we are in James, and we're working through the book of James. Not because I think at St. Andrews we have a real problem with this at the moment. I am extremely grateful that this has not been an issue at St. Andrews, but no church is immune. In fact, in the warfare, the stronger a church grows, the better a church is, the more likely it is to receive attacks from the devil. And as I said, one of his greatest tactics is to stir up fighting among ourselves, to turn our attentions to harming one another rather than doing good work in the world for God. So for the time comes when we may be tempted to fight one another, and may it not come, but if it were, we are to remember what James is going to say to us in chapters 3 and 4. We must be careful how we use our tongues, how we deal with one another. I'm not saying that we always must agree with one another, but when we respond to one another, when we do, it must be with wisdom from above, which always works towards peace. James has stressed that in the end of chapter 3. The end of wisdom from above is peace. Even through conflict, the goal that we are reaching is not our own superiority, not winning ourselves, but reaching peace with one another in love and concord. So let us keep these things in mind, have them in our back pockets, let them be working them out in our lives. So when the time comes, we need to remember this. We will have it there before us. We'll move on to how James answers this question next time. But for now, just a reminder that these sorts of fights, which have marked the church, And not just in our time, throughout its history, we must be on guard against the quarrels and fightings that we can find among us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.